everyone. This is Donna Blomquist from the LaSalle Public Library, welcoming you to our virtual program tonight. We'll be starting in just a few minutes with our composting program. Natalie Martin is standing by. Before we do, though, let me just make the two quick announcements about the programs that you see on your screen. The first one is in 2 weeks on Tuesday, October 19th at 6 o'clock. We will be welcoming artist and author Julie Zickelfus when she presents Saving Jemima, Life Love with a Hard Luck J. This is a really wonderful story, and it's way more than a wildlife rehab story, although that in and of itself is a wonderful tale. It's a story about dealing with great loss and finding strength and a future by bonding with this little wild bird. So I hope you'll join us for that. I think it's a great story. I've been to one of her programs and I can vouch for it. It's really more than heartwarming. It's inspiring. The next program will be October 27th. Now this will be at 6:30 new time on a Wednesday, new day. We will be working as a partner with the Palos Heights Public Library and welcoming Chris Bojalian. He is a best-selling author of 22 books, and his newest book, Hour of the Witch, is a historical novel, tale of suspense set in Boston in 1662 at the time of the Salem witch trials. So I hope you will be able to join us for that. It'll be an exciting interview and something that we'll all enjoy. And without spending any more time talking about promotions, we will welcome Natalie on. I understand that she has some earthworms there as our best friends for tonight. So Natalie, we're switching over to you.
Perfect. I have live guests in here. I almost said here in the studio. Nope. This is just an office above my garage. Hello to those of you who have not been in one of my programs before. I'm Natalie Martin. I'm a Master Gardener volunteer from the University of Illinois Extension. I do have some presentations and stuff to do tonight. I do have, of course, live earthworms that we'll talk about. I don't know how easy they're going to be able to see in this program, so you're just going to have to use your imagination, I guess, if you can't see it. I will go ahead and start sharing my presentation with you. I'm very deeply passionate about compost. I'm sure that will probably come through. Donna might comment that I seem to be passionate about a lot of things, and that's probably accurate, but I do love composting. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what compost is and how it can help you and why you should do it or what is right for you. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Master Gardener, Master Naturalist program. If you are not familiar with the program, it is a volunteer-driven organization. All of us are doing these programs because we are passionate about helping people develop gardening skills and spreading knowledge. So both on the Master Gardener side and the Master Naturalist side. If you think about things as gardening is the way that you grow things on purpose. Naturally, being a naturalist is like studying things that grow naturally in your area. So they do a lot more things with maybe habitat maintenance and things like that. And then gardeners, Master Gardeners like me, we do things like preserving gardens, both aesthetic and production gardens. For different cities or towns or groups, things like that. And then we do education programs like this one. So we do a lot of different things. If you are interested in becoming a Master Gardener or a Master Naturalist, you can contact the Extension office, which is based in Ottawa. There is an Extension office in every county in the state of Illinois. And if you are from out of state, because I know we do get some out of state folks, you probably have an Extension office for a similar university, agriculture-based university in your town or county. You just kind of have to Google Master Gardener and then whatever county you're in, and you can find programs. If you aren't familiar with the extension program, it is an arm education and assistance arm from the University of Illinois, and they do a ton of stuff. You might be like, no, they do Master Gardeners, they do Master Naturalists, and that's it. Nope, they do 4-H, they do farm assistance, they do dietary education, so many different things. So definitely check out the extension if you're interested in finding educators or resources for yourself, for your program. But we're going to dive into dirt. So we're going to talk about compost today, and you're like, Natalie, I don't want to talk about soil. I want to talk about compost. Well, we have to talk about soil because the compost is technically soil, right? Compost is going to be is an added thing into soil. And then you might have heard this word called dirt. Well, dirt is kind of when you pick something up on your shoe and it gets deposited in your house, that's going to be your dirt. A lot of times it's very nutrient, it's very nutrient less. It doesn't have a ton of nutrients in it. What we're looking at in this picture would be compacted, transplanted dirt. It doesn't have a lot of nutrient levels left in it. You can tell by that light brown color. It's pretty dried out, doesn't hold a lot of moisture. And it's not going to be the best for growing things. You still can't grow things. There's going to be things that are able to grow in dirt no matter what. Think about weeds. They can grow anywhere. Think about those trees that you see growing out of the side of a mountain. Plants will always find a way to grow. But the better you'll get more production if you're actually using soil to grow your things. Well, how do you take dirt and what makes if you have dirt, well, what makes soil soil? Soil is just going to have a higher level of organic content. It's going to have more microorganisms, maybe a difference in material. It's not just all one particle all together. I guess you could say that there's like a folk wisdom that says like a poor gardener grows weeds, a good gardener grows vegetables, and a great gardener grows soil, because you have to maintain and develop your soil in order to have a great garden. But don't worry, you can just buy it in the store if you don't want to make your own. Let's talk about types of soil. This is going to be pretty sciencey. Maybe if you've attended my programs before, you're like, I don't think Natalie is a scientist. That's pretty accurate, but I did have a background in science and I did have to take soils class. So I do know a little bit about soil, different types of soil, particle sizes, which we're going to talk about right now. But you can think of that soil is made up of 3 different things. You've got sand. We're all familiar with sand, right? Playgrounds, beaches, things like that. Silt, which is going to be maybe you can think of silt as what's at the bottom of the river. It's got, maybe like the broken up pieces of different particles. It's going to be very fine. And then clay. Clay is nutrient rich, but slow draining. Sand is quick draining, but has trouble retaining nutrients and moisture. So if you think about, you have a sand, like maybe a strainer or sand, and you pour water in it, it's going to come right at the bottom. And so is every nutrient that's with it. So it doesn't really hold on to the nutrients too well. And then loam is a combination of say, land, and humus. And humus is up here. It's not hummus. It's not made of chickpeas. Humus is the organic component of soil. So it's going to be what's made up of leaves and things that have broken down in that soil over time. Here in Illinois, we have what's called drummer soils mostly. Obviously, there's some variation depending on region, but drummer soil is a silty clay loam soil. And Illinois is known as having some of the most productive, most able to make, crops, things like that, most productive soil in the whole country. That's why we have a lot of agriculture and farming in certain parts of Illinois. But other parts, but they do tend to have a lot of clay, high clay proportion. So they're heavier, especially up here in Northern Illinois. So clay is very nutrient rich, like we talked about. And it doesn't make bad gardening because it has nutrient rich, everything needs to everything can eat it, has lots of things for plants to grow, but it can be challenging to get the right structure so that your things are a right amount of airspace and water space so that things can get through it, because that clay is so heavy and compacted so much. So that's kind of just a little, if you want a kind of general idea, visual idea, here we've got sand. And like, if you were going to think about that as like a BB size, like obviously we're blowing it up really big, but general BB size, like that would be the size of a BB. And then if you picture silt, be the size of a golf ball. And then like a grain of sand would be the size of a chair. So like this really big, whoa, you've got this teeny tiny BB, then you've got this golf ball, and then you've got this giant particle of sand. So that tells you just how small a particle of clay is. And that because it's so small, it compacts together so well. So then how do you determine what kind of soil you have? There's lots of different ways. You can do testing, you can get a soil core done, you can ask an expert, all sorts of different things. Master gardeners, unfortunately, cannot come onto private property, so we can't test your soil, but you can find kits and things like that can help you figure that out. But if you want to do a quick, easy test, you grab a handful of your soil. You want moist, but not like dripping wet, just kind of enough water in it that it feels a little damp. And you're going to squish it together in your hand like this. You'll squeeze it together. And when you open your hand, it could look something like these different pictures. Loam soil, it's going to kind of hold together, but it's come across in these little clumps here. Okay. So that's going to be your loam soil. That's kind of like what we're going for. We kind of want more loamy soil. Clay is going to just look like clay, like Play-Doh, right? You're going to squeeze it. It's going to hold together in exactly the shape that your hand is. Look, you can see your fingertip indentations right there. And then sand is just going to crumble apart. And just kind of like when you have, if it's wet sand, sometimes like at the beach, you can use it to mold into different things, but most of the time it will just crumble apart in the end. That's why we don't want super soggy, wet soil to test this way. So this is kind of an easy way to guess. And if you have something that is more on the sandy side, you may want to amend it with some more kind of loam or clay. And then if you have more clay, you can amend it with some sand, things like that. Can I take my dirt and make it into soil? Absolutely. You can add your compost into there. This could be store-bought compost like we talked about, or you can make your own. And compost is just, we might have said this already, compost is just organic matter that's been completely broken down. On the left, we have a heavy clay soil. So this is going to be soil that's full of clay. This is dried out clay, but this is clay. And then soil with lots of organic matter over here. And this is going to be what you might have thought this is what dirt looks like. But as we talked about, dirt has no nutrients. We want soil. Although you might not expect it, adding organic matter to soil will also help in a lot of other ways because over time, when you have good amended soil, your plants will require and reduce the need for supplemental chemicals because they're getting exactly what you need. So you don't necessarily need to add fertilizers. So there's a lot of great things that you can do. You can improve the ability of your soil to accept and store water, because if you have that really sandy soil, it's not going to hold the water in. So you're going to have to water your plants more often. It's going to increase the activity and the number of soil organisms. So those helpful critters that are in your soil, having healthy, diverse soil is going to increase the level of your bugs. If you're not a bug person, there's going to be some cringing later. I apologize in advance, but bugs in the matter of this presentation are very important. And then, although you might not expect it, when you add organic matter and you add that compost to your soil, it actually helps protect your water quality and the environment, because it will help limit the chemical runoff into your watershed. Because you're not having to add extra fertilizers and things like that, that fertilizer won't run off into your watershed. So it's like, there's like so many great reasons to add compost to your soil. Okay, how much do I add? You're like, Natalie, I've got this big area and I want to turn my dirt into soil. How much compost do I need? So landscape beds, these would be your non-production beds. So by production, I mean you're making food crops with them or growing food crops with them. So for landscape beds, you want to add 3 inches. That's not 3, Natalie. 3, maybe? Is this 3? 3, use a ruler. 3 inches of organic matter. So that means you're dumping on top of your bed, the landscape bed. Don't put it on your actual bed, gross. On your landscape bed, you're going to add 3 inches of compost. And then once your whole landscape bed is covered in those 3 inches, you're going to till it. You're going to mix it in with your actual dirt, because we already said you already got dirt. You want soil. You're going to mix it in until it's until the top 6 inches, 6 to 8 inches are mixed in. So you're going to add it. Don't worry, we're going to get how you make compost. I'm just covering the basics right now. If you have vegetable gardens or fruit gardens or things that are going to be production based, where they might need a few more nutrients, you might need a little bit more energy and good stuff in that garden bed, you want to add 6 inches and work that into the soil. You can also try mulch and add 3 inches of mulch. It does help in a lot of ways. This might be better for your landscape beds because those you don't have to grow things in there and things like that. It would still work okay for production beds, but landscape beds would be probably the best choice for mulch. But it'll help moderate your soil temperature, which helps out your plants because they don't have so much freeze thaw, things like that. It'll limit weeds and it'll help conserve water. So you can't add that. And then as it breaks down through the season, it will add nutrient deposits into the soil. So that's another option, that you can get that bagged mulch, or you can get a bulk mulch and spread that over your beds. And that can help. And you could do that at really any part of the season. Okay. So what is composting? So say you're not going to buy your own compost. Say you're like, hey, I have such big landscape beds. That's going to be too much compost. It's going to be really expensive. How can I make my own? Anybody can make their own compost. It's very easy because you will have plant matter, kitchen scraps, anything like that. And you can use those things to make your own compost. So compost is organic matter or plant matter that is changed into biologically humus rich. Now remember that humus is that broken down organic matter, the humus rich substance suitable for growing plants. So you take those plant products and you mix them all together with some other stuff and you make your own soil. It's magic. It's also alive. It's Halloween times because it's full of microorganisms and sometimes even macroorganisms, bigger bugs. So it's a variety, and they will eat those, help break down and eat those larger pieces of organic matter to help you break that down. And then right here, I think it's on your right. I don't think it's reversed. We have an example of a layered compost bin. And basically there's a couple different elements that we'll be talking about that are important for this. But basically you have your balanced organic matter, and we'll talk about that balance. You have air that's being able to move through here, and you can do that 2 ways. You can have lots and lots of micro and macroorganisms, or you can till it and mix it up yourself, and that's going to introduce fresh air into that compost area. This bin has walls with small gaps that help keep your heat in because it's a heat process. It's like a little oven in there. And as those organisms and like things start doing their work, they will develop heat, and that will allow them to go faster. They will allow it to kind of cook a little bit faster in there. In this situation, when you have a layered system, the oldest things are going to be at the bottom. So up at the top, it's going to look more like your actual raw materials, your organic matter, as it was to the beginning. Maybe it's kitchen scraps or whatever. That's going to look at the top. And as you go down, it's going to get broken down until it almost looks like soil at the bottom. It looks like up here, another way to add air would be adding grass clippings or those bigger things that introduce kind of pore space so that air can get there. And then you want to keep this covered because you want to keep it nice. Then you want to retain its moisture. You want to retain its heat level. So make sure you have a cover on your bin. Why would you want to compost? Why would this be something you would want to do? I already have, it's messy enough, Natalie. I don't need something that's smelly, has bugs, is another chore, things like that. Why would I want to do this? My number one reason for composting is definitely to reduce my waste. Food scraps and yard waste take up like 20 to 30%. That's like a general quote from the EPA, but general quote of the space of the trash in our landfills, 20 to 30%. So that's food scraps and yard waste that we can do with something else with, that's taking up that space for things like, plastics that aren't recyclable, things like that. So we can use that to reduce the amount of things that are going into landfills, which is amazing. Another thing that happens when you do throw those food scraps and those yard waste into the landfill is they build up methane faster, which, is what is helping to create like climate change is the global warming is happening with the carbon emissions, and methane is carbon emissions. Methane is what is one of those things that is helping with is contributing to climate change. So reducing the amount of methane that's produced from landfills is another side benefit. You can save money. You don't have to buy that soil at the beginning of the year. You don't have to worry about mulch necessarily, depending on what your yard waste is. So you can mulch with things like leaves and stuff like that. But saving money is definitely a big factor. And if you can make your own soil instead of having to buy so much bagged soil, that's awesome. You know what I mean? That's like a win-win-win. So what's happening inside of a compost pile? Compost pile contains microorganisms like bacteria and fungi. Those are things that we've heard of, right? Maybe you haven't heard of actinomycetes. Here's this little headshot over here. That's what he looks like, or she, they. And microorganisms like worms, cell bugs, centipedes, earwigs, things like that. Macroorganisms will break down those larger pieces. Those bigger pieces, they'll break them into more manageable, smaller pieces. And then the microorganisms come and sweep through and eat those smaller pieces. But the microorganisms really are what account for the majority of the work that's done in a compost pile. And when you're thinking of a microorganism, that's going to be something that is very hard for you to see with it's micro, it's tiny with your naked eye. So that's going to be something that's really going on below the surface. A lot of those creepy crawlies that we don't like are going to be those macroorganisms, those things that are big enough, are big enough for us to see. And then comes in the bacteria and fungus. And those things will use the carbon materials for energy and the nitrogen materials to build their bodies and reproduce. So you want to keep a nice balance, because these ecosystems, these compost piles, need a balance of carbon and nitrogen in order to be really, really productive. Actinomycetes are really cool. This is just a little aside, little special guy. Actinomycetes are really cool because they are able to decompose the more resistant organic substances. And they are actually the thing that helps make your soil like that dark black or the brown pigments when they finish up, like when the compost is getting towards the end. It's because of the actinomycetes that are making it that dark brown color. So, they're like a little superhero. Available oxygen, temperature, and moisture significantly affect the health of your compost area. So you have to kind of keep it a little happy ecosystem in order for it to really work well and to have a nice healthy balance of those macro and those microorganisms. As far as the steps go, here's kind of how it breaks down. Your original ingredients go right through here to the early stage decomposition. That might be when they start to wilt, when lettuce starts to wilt and things like that, things start to break down, your apples start to turn brown. But when you look in your bin, they're still going to look like a brown apple or whatever it is. When they get to this middle stage of decomposition here, your bacterial microorganisms start to go to work and your ingredients become less recognizable. Then you get into this late stage decomposition. Your ingredients are no longer recognizable. Some fungi or actinomycetes have started to begin working. You get to this later stage decomposition. All of your ingredients have transformed. Woody substances, things that are really, really tough to break down, things like sticks, big sticks, or maybe corn husks, things like that. They may still be recognizable, maybe eggshells, but everything else looks mostly like dirt. And then the curing is important because your pile begins to cool and the compost becomes ready to use. Oops. So we're going to jump really quick into a couple different methods of composting. I will say I don't talk very much about countertop or under counter composting. There are, if you do not have a ton of food scraps and you want to do things on a really small scale, there are in kitchen options. There's not really like machines necessarily, but they're little like almost like little trash bins that you keep on your counter. And as long as you keep your balances right, they shouldn't smell. A lot of times they have liners, disposable liners, so you can pull that out, maybe put it out into an outdoor bin once it started to get really, to break down. But they do, I know, like even like IKEA sells them, or really any store would have a little countertop place. And a lot of times what people use is they'll have like a little countertop compost bin. That's a starter. That's where they keep, like, every week they're going to put all their food scraps into this countertop, and then once a week they're going to bring it all outside. So sometimes it's working in conjunction. But there are like little individual sized, if you are small, you know, you have 1 or 2 people, you don't have a ton of food waste, you don't have a ton of vegetable scraps, you don't have a ton of yard waste. There are things that you can do to even save those small things that you have, and create, you know, a little compost system of your own. The first one, we're going to go from like least amount of work to most amount of work. Maybe not. Maybe I don't have them in that order, but we're going to go with like the start here, binless pile. This is the most passive. This is the least amount of work you could get into. It's literally just a pile. It should be several feet deep because you need to have that space inside your pile for that heat to build up, and you need it to be deep for that to happen. So in this situation, it's like recommended that you would have a 5 foot wide like pile by 3 feet high. So that's a big pile. So that means that whatever you would have, it would be buried underneath it. It can take several months or a year to achieve usable compost. And that's because this is, it's just open to the elements. Things, you know, it can dry out, it can lose its heat, it can get too much moisture from rain, it can not have enough moisture because it hasn't rained. So it's just a lot more, left to chance. But the nice thing about this is that it is easy to till something like this. It's easy to move it around and reintroduce that air. So there are some pros. It's cheap. You don't have to do anything to get it started. You can literally just say, hey, I want to have a compost pile. I have this unused spot over here. It's going to be out of the way. Let's go for it. And you could just start it, and you could figure out, and you could use that as the opportunity to figure out what works for you. But it is difficult to move if you choose to not like that area, and it is hard to maintain that depth because as things break down, you're going to have to continually be adding more and more and more things into it to continue to maintain that depth. So keep that in mind. This is a really cool system called trench composting. It's not expensive, right? Because it doesn't require a lot of equipment, but it could be a little labor intensive. But basically, this is a multi-year system, and it's built into your garden. So basically, like this would be if you had, this is a raised bed that they're showing in the picture. This central trench is where you're depositing all of your compost. All of it goes into here. And then you continue to cover it as as you fill it up, you add more and more and more. And then at the end of year 1, whenever that is for you, you cover it all the way. And that is where on year 2 over here, this is where your plants are going to get planted. So that means the idea is that you're going to be planting your plants right on top of the most nutrient rich area that you have. All of those nutrients are right there on top. And those plant roots and things like that will help break down even further any compost that is still not yet broken down. You can see that there is walking space built in to here. And that's just because if you had 2 areas of compost next to each other, it might be too much organic material all in that area. It might not break down as much because you have too much there. So it's that you have this rotation going. So you always have one area that is reserved and in waiting, and then another area that is going to be for compost, and another area is for plants. So you can see here we were in year 2, you planted your plants over in the compost area, and then year 3, it goes into the compost trench where you would have all that nutrient rich area. And it's just a really cool idea, and it's a really great way to utilize your space, and you don't have that big pile of compost to worry about either. It is a really simple way. It does, like I said, it's not super labor intensive because you are just digging, but it's not as easy as just throwing things in a pile. So this trench is about 1 foot deep. And then you would like kind of chop and mix your food wastes into the soil. Like you could use a tiller or a chopper as you mix it in, and then cover it with about 8 inches of soil at a time. Depending on the soil temperature and supply of microorganisms, it should go through that whole process within that 1 year. So that's the idea. and then you would rotate the areas. A 3-bin system, now we're getting a little bit, this is still a very classic system, but we are getting a little more labor intensive. We're having to build things. You can buy bin systems. You can basically, anything that we have here, you can also buy. Even that trench system, they have compost bins right now that are a compost bin that's aerated on the sides, that's set down into a raised bed planter. If I think about it, if you guys remind me, I can find a link for it at the end of this program. But so that's example of kind of using that trench composting idea, but a commercial item you can buy yourself. Oh, it's already 6:30, folks. I think I'm going good on time though. A 3-bin system though is basically similar to that trench composting system. You would have this set up off to the side. Your first bin, which is over here, you can kind of see it's got the least broken down of everything there. And then once that, say this would be like a year's worth or 6 months or whatever, you transfer it you would take whatever's in bin 2, transfer it to bin 3, and then transfer bin 1 into bin 2. And this would go through the late stage decomposition over here in bin 3, and then go through its curing over there. And then each 6 months or a year or however productive it is, you would rotate it through this bin system, boom, boom, boom. And then whenever it's done in bin 3, it's ready to be used in your garden. It's a pretty intuitive system. You just have to kind of keep in mind your timelines. Oh, it was 6 months. Okay. Or I'd say I'll check it in 6 months. No, I want to go a year. It needs to break down more. And a lot of folks will keep a pile over here to mix in off to the side or in a bin with their yard scraps, so that they always have stuff at the ready to mix in. It looks like they have specific recommendations. There's a 3x3x3 would be the smallest you would want to go, and 5x5x5 would be the biggest for a single bin. You can do this. I have had just a single bin system, which would be like a layered system. If you think about it that way, you would put in your food scraps, layer it, and then put in food scraps, layer it, put in food scraps. And you can turn it and things like that, but it's kind of hard to access. So having things with this front end access is really nice. A lot of times if you have these walls here, this is for bin 3, where it's just sitting. You're not doing anything with it. It's during a curing and late stage decomposition. But you want to be able to get to bins 1 and 2 so you can start to till things in there. You do want to keep those moist, just like with anything. Moisture is any sort of growing anything. Microorganisms and bacteria need to be moist in order to be alive. Everything needs water. And again, this process will take just about a year. These are 2 commercial system options. This is a stacking bin system. You should be able to have sifters and access to each of these would be like a drawer that you would pull out, and you can kind of shake it around and let the particles fall through, and it would get smaller and smaller and smaller until you get to the bottom. And then there would be a door here that you can access the finished compost from the bottom. And then this is a tumbler system. Basically, the idea is you throw all of your stuff in there and you tumble it, you really roll it, mixes it all together. That introduces that air. The only issues with these ones, they do tend to take up space sometimes. They take up space for what's not going to end up being a lot of compost. They can be kind of expensive. Their capacity is fairly limited as far as what you can have. But it is a good choice if you are on a small yard, you still want to do something, you don't have a ton of food scraps. They can be fairly productive, especially these tumbler ones, because you're constantly moving them. They're easy to turn. So they can be fairly productive, and they are nice and black and get lots of heat. So these ones over here are kind of difficult to turn. If you do have to mix it, they don't have those sifters. You have to figure out a way to get down in here and mix stuff from the bottom to the top and vice versa. So that can be really challenging. And then we'll talk about vermicomposting. I am new to the world of vermicomposting. We just started ourselves, but vermicomposting is harnessing the power of worms to make compost. They are worms themselves are really productive. They do a lot of eating. They do a lot of making soil, and they are pretty self-sufficient. So it's a really nice way to do some composting. I have mine. I can maybe stop my share for a second. I have mine in this bin. Ugh. I don't have my lid on it so that I can access it. Eek. So you can see I've got, sorry, everybody, got wires all over the place. So you can see I've got my bin here. I have these air holes put in top. I also have air holes in my lid, and my worms are down inside. Let's see if I can get you to see I've got some bedding. I actually just added this bedding, so it hasn't started to break down. I've got some bedding mixed in with some really good soil. Again, to wait to tell if your soil is wet enough, you would press it in your hand. If it kind of holds together with just a little bit of crumbling apart, but some still loose particles, that's going to be wet enough. You don't want it to be sloppy because things will start to mold in there. Some questions I get about worm composting are, does it smell? If you're doing things right, no compost should smell. We're going to ask that. We're going to get to that a little later. Oh, my wires here are in my worm bin. That no compost should smell. You should have a nice buffer layer between things that are breaking down and your nose. You should have a nice little buffer layer so that you don't actually smell anything. If things are smelling, that means that something is out of balance. That either means you don't have enough oxygen, it's too wet. Usually too wet and too much oxygen, or not enough oxygen, are the two problems, because think about when something starts to mold, it's been in the absence of that oxygen. Or if it's too wet and it starts to like that, you know how you're things get mildewy when they're too wet. That's exactly what can happen in your bin. Sorry, I'm going to try to find you a worm here. I pulled a little bin aside that had some worms in, and of course they already went to the bottom. Worms are natural aerators, so that's one of the things that's really nice about vermicomposting, is that you can they will do a lot of that work for you. You literally just put your soil base together and then you just set them on top, and they will make their own way down to the bottom. Jiminy Christmas, where are these worms? They're literally just, oh, here's one. So these are a commercially purchased worm. I just ordered them literally from a place called Jim's Worm Farm. And this is a red wiggler. They are the most commonly used for vermicomposting. Regular earthworms can be used as well. You can go and get worms literally from your backyard. You don't have to order them like I did. They, when you order them from a place, they're usually, you definitely know they're guaranteed to be alive, things like that. That's a nice part. So I'm wiping off my mud hands. I think worms are seen as innately dirty, when really, it's the dirt that's dirty. It's not the worm itself. They just have slimy little bodies that hold the dirt onto them. That slime, I learned, is like a sun protection, and it's also like helps them be underwater when it's wet. So worms are pretty cool. I'm passionate about worms, I guess, as well. So you can keep that bin really anywhere. I keep it in my basement. You don't want it to be too hot. Worms don't like it as hot, they talked about heat in the regular standard compost bins, but you don't want it to be as hot. So I keep it in my basement where it's kind of nice and cool. I feed them about once a week. You want the particles to be fairly small. So you might want to, this might be too much work for everybody, but I throw in like pieces of carrots and stuff like that. It just takes longer to be more productive. The smaller the particle size, when you put it in, the smaller the pieces, the more productive, the more compost that you're going to make. So just think about that. It's a little bit of extra work, but you can keep, like, if you have a day that you do a lot of your cooking, you just throw all of your food scraps into the like a food processor or a blender, make them into kind of like chopped chunks, and then put it in a container in your fridge, and you can feed it to your worms throughout the week, and they will love it. Or you can, no pressure. You don't have to do anything like that. That's just what I do. So to talk about setting up your own worm bin, there's a lot of different ways. You can buy commercial worm bins. Again, you don't have to make your own. This was a $4.60 bin that I got from Target. And then we drilled the holes ourselves, and then we added some peat moss and some other things that we already had. And then you saw I added bedding. It's just shredding for my husband's office. You can use newspaper shreds. You can use paper towels and cardboard and things like that. You can use organic material from your yard, but it needs to be something that is more woody, that they can use to make bedding rather than being more organic material. It will break down over time, but that's not what you're looking for. You're looking for maintaining moisture and things like that. 5 to 10 gallon box or bin is usually about what you would want. 24 by 18 by 8 is like the minimum. The box should be shallow rather than deep. Mine's pretty deep, but I don't have it filled all the way to the brim. That way it's easy for me to dig around in there. Red wigglers usually dwell on the surface, and they like to live in that top 6 inches of soil. You can line the bottom with plastic and cover the bin with a loose fitting lid, but the lid should allow air in. So that's why we drill those holes and stuff in the top. Usually you can turn over your worms to keep them more productive. And that means you would basically take your compost, your whole worm bin, and dump it into a storage container. I like to put it out on a tarp. Like at that point, you could literally start all over again, buy new worms, do that kind of thing if you don't want to do this process. But I spread out a tarp, I dump the compost, and I pull all the live worms and put them back in my bin. And then the rest is considered just compost. So then if you want to, then we can go into worm composting in depth if anyone has questions. I have a feeling that, we're talking surface level right now, but if you do have more specific worm questions about how and when to harvest and things like that, how do you know if it's healthy? You can ask me at any time. But here in this picture, you can see we've got our bedding, which is our paper scraps, our organic material, which is like a lot of times you start with compost that you either already have or store-bought compost. And then you mix in there, you can see there's food pieces and stuff like that. That's considered part of the organic material. I have dirt all over my desk now. And then we've got these air holes for the aeration. So a lot of those elements from those other compost bins are here present in vermicomposting. Air, moisture, not necessarily heat, but organic material and things like that all exist in vermicomposting. You might be wondering what all can and can't I compost? I don't want to be running out of time here. I've got a couple more slides. So we'll go through this this one here, and then we can motor through the rest of them. But kind of some good rules of thumb when you want to know what to compost, you can think of 2 different categories for what to compost. You can think of green materials, which are things like grass clippings, actual green things, leaves, things like that, kitchen scraps and coffee ground filters and coffee grounds, those things that break down pretty easily, those things that mold pretty fast, those would all be considered green things. And then when you think of brown materials, a lot of times it's more woody substances. I'll give you a little cheater hint. These are the things that are more carbon rich. Things that don't break down as quickly, like corn cobs and corn stalks. Those are going to be very carbon rich brown materials. Do not ever compost. And I say do not ever. Some people have very lax rules about what they compost. But when you think about things like meats, fishes, cooked food items, oils, anything like that, those are going to, first of all, smell. Those are going to contribute to high contents of smell. It's going to contribute to lots of bacteria. When you have things like meat and fish, there's a higher chance of bacteria to be in those. They're going to attract pests like raccoons and things like that to them, specifically because of smells. And they're not going to create a compost that you're going to want to put back onto your plants, because there's a higher chance that it would have toxic or unsavory ingredients in it. Just like how you wouldn't want to put rancid meat into your own body, you don't want to put it into your compost as well. Other things that should be no-brainers as far as do not compost would be non-organic materials like plastic, styrofoam, glass, metal. Obviously metal does break down over time, but it's not something that you're going to want to put on your plants. So don't worry about it. And then diseased plants, anything that could be considered to be a weed or a plant that has a disease, you don't want to keep in that compost, because there's the chance of those things spreading. Weed seeds and things like that. There's been many reports of those spreading in bagged mulch and bagged compost, bagged soil, because whatever the company was that made those products was not careful enough about what went into it. Jenna asks, what about plain grains like pasta or rice? Rice is one thing because it is plain, but pasta doesn't contain ingredients like flour and eggs. So you might just want to exclude those if they're raw and haven't been cooked yet. I mean, yeah, you could probably go ahead and throw it in there. It's probably not going to hurt too much, but it might just not break down as much as you want. And I would say lean more towards the rice because that is actually a plant product. And pasta would be processed food, like not processed in a negative way. Processed is in like it went into a process to make it. So great question. Oops. So here's kind of a simplified guideline. We talked about things having higher, like that, those brown items are carbon based, which that can mean that the more green materials would be more nitrogen based, higher level of nitrogen ratio to carbon. They're still all going to have carbon. We're all made of carbon. Carbon atoms are the most commonly atoms found in the whole on Earth, but they're going to have a higher ratio of nitrogen to carbon than those brown items. So you want a greater amount of carbon containing material. So that would be your brown items. Then you want nitrogen material, which are those green items, about 2/3 to 1/3. You can think of that way, whatever ratio works for the size that you're working with. The other thing you can do if you are going to weigh things, I don't think that's as common. I think we're mostly going to just eyeball or measure, but they're going to be equal in weight. And you can think of that even though you have more of these carbon items, they're going to have less moisture to them. So they're not going to weigh as much. These nitrogen, those green items are going to weigh more. So you're going to want equal weights of both of those. But if you're going to be doing them by measure, 2/3 of green, or I'm sorry, 2/3 of brown matter, carbon matter to 1/3 of nitrogen or green matter. If your compost seems too wet, you just add more carbon matter. If it seems too dry, you add more nitrogen or green matter. So it kind of works both ways. You can see things here. We've done it in layers. We're keeping things in there that in nice layers, and we're mixing a bunch of things in between. Quick note about livestock manure. Livestock manure and pet and human manure are two different things. Many folks include livestock manures in their compost, and that's totally fine. It's just up to you about whether you want to deal with it. Human and pet manure is going to have a higher risk of bacteria because we're meat eaters. The more meat you eat, the better chance there is of bacteria in your feces. And that includes dairy. So even if you're a vegetarian, I don't eat meat, I'm a vegetarian, but if you eat things like eggs and things like that, instead of processed materials, there's still a better chance that you will have bacteria in your feces, and we should not put those into compost. That's a whole nother ball game. Quick lists of some higher carbon items, things like shredded newspaper, shredded cardboard, straw, sawdust, wood chips, things like that. A lot of folks will just keep a big pile of wood chips right next to their compost bin. So whenever they add their nitrogen material, their green material, they'll add some brown material, carbon material. Green and nitrogen rich materials would be those coffee grounds, kitchen scraps, grass clippings. They say weeds, but that's really a personal choice. And then of course your fish emulsions and your blood meal and your hair and fur. Don't forget to compost those things. As far as maintenance goes, I think this is going to be one of my last things I really want to hit hard is it can basically, the more active you want to be with your composting, the more productive it's going to be. You absolutely can throw it in your pile, let it sit, but it might take a really long time, or maybe more than a year in order for it to get going. If you're actively turning it, you're turning it often, maybe once a week, maybe twice a week. You're keeping the water content. This is a measurement, but 40 to 60% water by weight, whatever that means to you. If you have a good ratio of carbon to nitrogen, and it couldn't take even 2 to 6 weeks to get that turned over if you're being really active and turning over your compost very often. That might also be on a smaller scale. You're doing small bin movements, things like that. You'll know your compost is done and won't harm any plants, because if it hasn't gone through that curing, it still could have this high microorganism activity. Could be too hot for your plants. It could just have too much going on and not be completely nutrient rich yet. So it could harm your plants if it's not ready. it's pulling nitrogen from the soil. I see that. But it's going to, if you would wait for your pile to cool, or decreases by about 1/3, to about 1/3 of its original volume. And this pile is going to be dark and crumbly, just like in this picture. It has an earthy odor. It doesn't smell like anything really, except for dirt. And the temperature is within 10 degrees of the air. And that means that there's not as much production going on. It's not going crazy in there anymore. And it started to calm down, and it's done working through all that organic matter. How do you determine what is right for you? It's really going to be very personal. It's going to be about what kind of space you have. What do you want to compost, as in what kinds of items do you want to compost? Maybe you only want to compost. You don't want to worry about your kitchen scraps at all. You only want to do your yard clippings. It's just about how much you want to do, and how does it work for you? How much waste do you have per week? Is that something you're worried about? And then you want to think about what you're going to do with it when it's done. Are you going to have a pile of dirt that you give to your neighbors? Are you going to be able to use it in your yard? How much time can you spend on it a week? Maybe you don't have time to go out and turn it 2 to 3 times a week, 1 to 2 times a week. So maybe you need a different system. And then what's your yuck factor? There is going to be dirt and food pieces and worms potentially that are going to be in here. So is that something you can deal with? I totally get it if it's not. And then how committed are you? That's going to help determine, how much time you want to spend on it, maybe what system you use, and how much you want to spend. Here are some of the, I didn't say this at the beginning, but this was adapted from a program from the Texas A&M Extension Office. And they did an amazing job with this. I just kind of sifted it down. They had even more in-depth, if you can imagine that, resources in here. So I kind of sifted it down for beginners, but here's what the resources that they used to make the meat of this presentation. And then I am available if anybody has some questions or wants to know more about any of the specific types of composting we talked about. Maybe you want to show me your worms. It's up to you.
Wow. Well, that was a lot, Natalie. And
I feel like I was talking very, very fast.
Always passionate. While we're waiting to see if anyone else has questions, I will fill that time with a couple of my own, as you knew I would.
Yes, I was waiting.
Okay, so I'm looking at your traditional compost bins and the slats of wood on the sides with the little tiny openings in between them.
Yes.
And we're trying to keep the heat in, but I am assuming that those spaces were to let air in also?
Correct. Yeah, there's going to be a different, and it's going to probably also depend on your atmosphere. I'm going to guess this one says University of Vermont Extension, but those gaps here, those seem a little wide for me. I feel like your dirt's going to fall right out the sides. You know what I mean? But maybe it's got mesh. It might have mesh like this and we just can't see it. We're going to give them the benefit of the doubt. I'm not going to judge their compost bin. So my suggestion would either be something similar to this top one, maybe some slats like this, but that are wider spaced, maybe mesh on the sides and wider space on the top. And then I've seen compost bins that have a swing door. Each of these is they either have one big swing door across all the fronts, or they have a swing door across each one, or that these are just panels that can slide up and down. That's a little tricky because if your soil starts to cascade out the bottom, it's hard to get that door all the way back down. So it's whatever works for you.
And in looking at these bins, the 3x3x3s, we were talking at the very beginning about if you were doing food gardening and you wanted to add a 6-inch layer of composted soil on the top. If you had a 3x3x3 bin, how big of a raised bed or area would that cover with 6 inches?
So let's say it's full, right?
Okay.
So that's going to be 1 cubic yard, right? 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet is 1 cubic yard. And that's how they do a lot of gardening math. I'm not a good math person. So if you hear me say something wrong, tell me. But so that's going to be 1 cubic yard. So then you're going to go and say, okay, I've got, I don't know, maybe you have a 3 foot by 3 foot bin. but you only need to do 6 inches. So, okay. So 1 foot is going to be a third of a cube, like you would do a third. And then, so it would be, what's half of a third? And
6.
6. Okay. So then you would have, okay, you just have to do math. Okay, Donna, like you just have to do some math. But this bin would start off, if you filled it up, it would start off to be about 1 cubic yard full. And then
we'll
we
take
said,
it, we'll take it off in 6-inch layers.
Correct. But as it decomposes, it's going to lower down. So you're going to end up with like it's going to be a third of a cubic foot by the time you're done.
Okay.
So then you can figure out that math. You're welcome.
I'll do that. And if I can come up with the right answer and have someone check it, we'll include it.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
I'm going to stop some sharing because we have some questions about what the price of worms is. And I'm going to go to the place that I got my worms from. This is not a paid ad, but it was called Jim's Worm Farm. And Uncle Jim's Worm Farm, excuse me, I misspoke. So Uncle Jim's Worm Farm, he sells, nope, that's mealworms. I don't want mealworms. Gross. He buy live worms. He sells red wigglers, and I bought 100 composting worms, and that cost me $23. So if that helps you, Mary, that's 100 worms. That's going to be a good start, but it might, the more worms you have, the more productive it will be. You know what I mean? But you also have to think they do have information about like what size worm bin you have versus how many worms you might need. So definitely whatever size you're thinking of, think about that. If you're looking at composting, how much compost costs, it's going to depend on how you buy it and where you buy it from. You can buy bulk compost. I bought bulk compost and bulk mulch from Akana Nursery up in Mendota this year. If you're looking for like compost from Home Depot, you can buy that. Right now they've got, that's just premium grade potting mix. That's not what I want. It doesn't have, it's out of season for compost. You know what I mean? It looks like they don't have, oh, here it is. So they have Nature's Cure 1 cubic foot compost for $5.97. So it's going to be, that's going to be a general price. It's going to be about what works for you. What do I feel about purchasing a bin made for composting? Go for it. Absolutely. If you're not cheap like me, absolutely. Or even if it's not cheapness, it's that you just can't fathom building one, making one, figuring that out. I totally get it. Go for it. There's nothing wrong with them. 100%. It's just going to be about figuring out which one works for you. Those tumbler ones, those are great. They have a limited capacity. So, that's going to be the thing. If you have a ton of food waste or food scraps, I shouldn't say food waste because, food scraps are, the outsides of onions, things like that we can't physically eat, but you don't want to put them into your garbage. So, definitely, if you have a lot of food scraps, you might want a bigger bin. And I hope that was helpful. Definitely feel free to buy one. They have them all over. You can buy them. Even your local soil and water conservation district usually sells the tumbler composting bins. And then all of that money goes right to your soil water district rather than to a third party. So definitely keep that in mind. South County, I know, has sold them, those and rain barrels off and on. So definitely call them and see if they have any of those available. Thank you for joining us tonight, Michelle. I know that she was logging off. But other than that, I think that feel free to just start at whatever level you feel comfortable with is for sure composting. And you can start it and go, nope, not for me. And then back out of it, no problem. If you do live in a municipality, you might want to check. Sometimes they do have group composting situations where you can just save up your food scraps in a bucket and bring them there at the end of your week or whatever. And then usually once whoever's contributing for it, it's almost like a co-op. That whoever's contributing to it will get to take the compost at the end. So, but a lot of that's usually more in an urban setting or municipality kind of area, not necessarily out here in rural areas. But someone should start that. So I would participate if you wanted to.
Natalie, before
Yes.
we close for tonight, I have two questions. When
Yeah.
you said 100 worms, you purchased 100 worms.
Uh-huh.
Were there 100 worms in your worm container?
Yeah, there
Wow.
were. I don't know if they're really good at hiding or they died,
Oh,
but I hope not. We're just going to go with that. They're really good at hiding. I didn't
I'm
do a
going with
thorough
that
job.
too. Okay,
Yes.
and before we close for tonight, we've done so much conversation about carbon. I have to let everyone know that we're going to add a link to an NPR little article. It's kind of little cartoons about carbon and how it works around us, and it's for everybody, even us, non-scientists.
Yeah.
So I'm going to put that link on. I hope everybody will enjoy it. It's for
Perfect.
adults.
I
And
look forward to watching it.
yeah, and with that, wasn't there a link we were supposed to get from you about? I've lost my spot. What were you going
Oh.
to give us? Oh, I see.
I talked about maybe looking up something for somebody.
Trench system.
Oh, the trench composting systems. Let me just pull up a tab really quick.
Or you can send me the link and I'll attach it
yeah,
tomorrow.
I should be able to. Oh, here, I've got it right here. I'll put it up on
All
the
right.
screen. I need to share a tab, don't I? Something. Share. Sorry. It's like I forgot how to work it. Here it is. So this is an example. I'll just open these images so that it's nice and big. This is an example of a commercial. It's called a sub pod. This is pretty trendy right now. It's basically a metal raised bin. And then in here in the middle, there's like a plastic perforated composting bin. And it has a little guide. It's really helpful. It's a little guide of what you should be putting in. And then you do your mixing and stuff like that in here. And then you plant your plants all around the outside, and they use the nutrients and the everything from that composting center area to grow. But you can see they're kind of pricey, $319 or things like that. So it's all about what your price point is and what's going to work for you. You probably could also build one of these yourself, put a little, plastic tote or something like that in the middle that's perforated and do it that way. So really whatever works for you.
All right. Thank you. And I will be, Rachel will be putting up the recording tomorrow. And any other questions, as Natalie said, we can always get them to her. And I think you also had your information in the beginning.
I think it was either in the beginning or at the end. My contact info, if anyone needs to ever reach out to me.
All right. Well, that will be it for Natalie now. We have more programs coming up. We were discussing one before this program, but we'll talk more about that tomorrow, and it will be posted.
Thank you so much, everybody.
And thank you, Natalie, and thank you, everyone. We'll say good night.
Have a good night.